none of the stuff that these companies do is simple. It's very complicated, and you need actual competence and motivation to do your very best.
Yeah, the last thing I want to see is Airbus or its supply chain iterate some of the practices that you've seen in America recently or over the past decades. You know, the mass layoff as a just way of basically changing the quarterly earnings.
Welcome to Category Leaders, where we unpack the stories of European companies who've won their category globally. We believe that studying these category-leading companies, telling their stories, and distilling those insights helps us build and invest in better companies for the future. Best in the world, based in Europe. Welcome to Category Leaders.
This episode, we're looking at Airbus. This is a story of Europe building a capability that the world needed, taking on the Americans in the stiffest competition where they had 90-something% market share in civil aviation, integrating various companies across Europe, iterating, and at this point in time, 2025, being the clear category leader in civil aviation. So, sitting here today, Airbus has won. It's beaten Boeing, its long-term nemesis, revenue, production, and every even business metric that matters, Airbus is winning. But is that the real story? That's where we are today. But how did we get here? So Martti, you have history here. What's your take on Airbus, and how does this story break down?
Well, thanks, Colin, and good day, everybody. I had the great pleasure of working with Aerospatiale, which was one of the predecessors of Airbus, while I was in the university, and I was in the office of avionics, sitting next to the guy who was giving all the product support for Concorde Avionics, and also had a chance of visiting the prototype number 3 of the aircraft with this guy. So one of those tours that I will always remember. Also, that was the time when the company canteen served lunch, where there were waitresses serving meals to the table, and you were able to get red wine or white wine for lunch every single day.
So these were the days. This spells kind of French 90s.
Yeah, and the world is not that way anymore. But one thing that is absolutely important to remember, those were the days when individual professionals, they committed to one business for life. They worked for one company for their entire professional career, and also the employer was extremely committed to these individuals, because they were the people who made miracles, and the employees felt that they are serving a purpose that is much larger than life in itself. So it was a very different time. But let's move on. I mean, that's history. That world is not coming back. And we have a lot to cover. I mean, Airbus is a fascinating company. And in order to cover this, let's try to make it in 5 different chapters. First, the startup stage from the 60s to 70s and 80s. Then the duopoly, when the United States and Europe were fighting head-to-head in the 80s and 90s. Then the emergence of low-cost carriers and essentially the disruption of the whole airline business model, Boeing's merger, Airbus becoming a united company. Then, of course, we are interested in defense. So let's address the defense aspect of Airbus, because the defense has always been there, but never really became very dominant. And then, of course, in the end, let's say a few words about how Airbus looks today and going forward.
Absolutely. And I think those 5 chapters make a lot of sense. But first, a confession at my end. I fly on planes. I've flown on a lot of planes. But when I did the research for this episode, and I read a lot of books about Airbus, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts about Boeing, they very much focused on the plane. And I have a confession, is I'm not a plane fan. I know this is kind of heresy when you're doing the story of civil aviation. I found it very difficult to find real numbers that looked beyond the along the plane number, and actually talked about the business numbers. So I'm going to kind of resist the plane fandom or the plane porn, and I'm going to focus my conversation particularly around what did we learn about Airbus? What did we learn about the capability that it unlocked at this point in time? And less on, was it 2 engines or 4 engines? Did it do this or do that? That's part of the story. But I really want to tell the story about coordination developing into capability. Anyway, caveats out of the way. Martti, let's start with a dream. Let's start with a dream of Europe.
Yeah, and I want to paint a picture. If we look at the time after the Second World War, that is the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of aircraft designs that were competing in the marketplace. Of course, we had all the propeller aircraft, but then we started having jet-engined aircraft in the 50s. I mean, the British de Havilland was one of the leaders with the Comet aircraft that was unfortunately had a very, very bad ending due to the fact that we learned quite a bit about metal fatigue in the accidents that the Comet had in the 50s. So in a way, a major failure, but revolutionized structural design of aluminum structures. We had Caravelle in Europe. We had plenty of others. In United States, there were many manufacturers for aircraft. And then actually the catalysator, you could say, for the change was actually United States Air Force, because the Air Force needed to have a tanker aircraft. And then they contracted several bidders, and the way how US Air Force was already in those days contracting was that they are actually ordering prototypes. It's easier to choose the winning design when you have the aircraft and you can fly it.
Okay, so it wasn't even choosing basically based on a design. It was
no, not at all.
something.
I mean, essentially, they paid for the design and they paid for the building of the first samples of aircraft. And both Boeing, what eventually became Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8, both were originally designed for the U.S. Air Force aerial refueling tanker aircraft project, which eventually became the KC-135 that was a Boeing winner. But the main thing is that U.S. government was paying for the development of aircraft in that category. 4 engines, having a major cargo carrying capability. And then what eventually Douglas, I mean, it was not even merged with McDonnell in those days. Douglas came with DC-8. I mean, they lost the competition, but they came up with the DC-8 design, which was, of course, a massive change to the small single-aisle twin-engined aircraft that were dominating the marketplace in those days. And this story already emphasizes that when you talk about aviation, you cannot talk about aviation without the government. Government is always there, even if there are private companies that are operating. Government and government money is present all the time.
So really it was the US Air Force's requirements that kind of shifted American aviation into a particular production space.
To a specific direction, to specific designs. And that's why, I mean, we could even argue today whether those aircraft types would have ever been developed unless there was the original design that was funded by US government.
And really what happened was that Europe struggled, individual companies or countries in Europe struggled to basically meet that requirement. They just didn't.
I mean, they were not even competing with that requirement, and I don't even think that they were not necessarily even struggling. They were just competing with each other. And the thing is that the U.S., I mean, Lockheed was very active in civil airliners in those days in the United States, but very quickly the U.S. market consolidated. And Europe was really the one with many different suppliers, manufacturers, designers. Europe just lacked focus. We were competing with each other rather than working together, which was the reason why Airbus was needed. It was felt at the government, at the European government's level. France, Germany, UK, originally they felt that, okay, we can't compete with these guys unless we start working together. And that was the reason, the political decision to build the whole Airbus. That's what it was. And the company was founded in 1970 as essentially these 3 nations being in the leader. Of course, the Brits jumped ship quite early, but Hawker Siddeley as a supplier in UK continued to work as a subcontractor, even if UK government didn't want to follow that.
And the Brits jumping early, sorry, stereotypes, but this was basically Harold Wilson, the then Prime Minister, worried about basically the balance sheet, worried about cost, or not being committed to Europe.
Yeah, and I mean it's aviation contains huge risks. It's an old saying that if you want to make a small fortune in aviation, the easiest way is to start from a big one. And it's not a joke. I mean, there are so many airline companies, there are so many aircraft manufacturers who end up losing money. It's not, by nature, it's not very profitable, and it is not risk-free. And somebody to just choose to go elsewhere, in many cases, has been the wise decision. And that's part of the reason why governments have been so active in this thing, because just private companies and private money to take the risks involved has been, let's say, unrealistic for many, many owners. So that's why governments have been instrumental both in United States, in the Soviet Union, which was, of course, very active in aircraft design and manufacture all those years, and also in Europe. The government is only involved in different ways, but the inherent risks of making a profit are essentially have been requiring the presence of government money and patient capital to be in the process.
But it's difficult to just talk about governments, because effectively a government feels like an amorphous blob of something. What about the actual early founders, the actual people who kind of brought this dream to life of this Airbus, this combined entity about Europe? Who are they?
And indeed, you are touching the right point. Even in governments, unless somebody has the passion to push things forward, the governments are not necessarily taking the action all by themselves. And we can list at least three guys who were instrumental in the beginning. Roger Bataille, who was an engineer and diplomat, which is actually a very typical career path in France, that you are switching between industry and government very fluidly. There was Henri Ziegler, another one. Talk about that in a few moments. Felix Kracht in the German side, and you could say that these were the people that were driving the thing in the beginning. When we talk about Henri Ziegler, he was a graduate from École Polytechnique, which means that the word used for those people who graduated, they are called polytechniciens. And when you are part of that, when you are a polytechnicien, you are part of a semi-conspicuous secret society.
Okay.
And you are very, very well connected to both the government and the major industrial companies. So that's, even today, if you are a polytechnicien, then it means that you are part of the inner circle.
Okay, so this is somebody coming from an elite, prestigious school.
One of the few absolute top elite schools in France, and École Polytechnique, of course, being the engineering school. And he also went to Supaero, which is the aerospace university in Toulouse, and one of the most respected universities in the world when it comes to aerospace. He was also acting Henri was acting also as the Director General for the Civil Aviation Authority. He was a pilot, but he ended up running Sud Aviation, which is one of those companies that eventually became Aerospatiale, the company that developed and built the Caravelle. And also, that was the same company. Sud Aviation was really the company who initiated the Concorde program together with the British. And he was the first CEO of Airbus from 1970 to 75. Very, very well connected politically, and very, very skillful in negotiating between the different governments that were involved with this one. That is French, German, and British governments. And because even today, you can see that even if we are part of European Union, at least most of us, it's a very brotherly relationship. There are these brotherly feuds and wrestles all the time. It wasn't different in the 60s and 70s. There was all the time this, some people might call it even animosity between the nations, a true love-hate relationship. And in order to have something work together, you really needed a very, very skillful diplomat to bring these people together and accept that we won't be doing that alone.
Yeah, and again, the recent backdrop, this is 1950s and the 60s. We've just gone through World War II, right? France and Germany, they weren't friends at that particular point.
No,
so
they were not.
Looking at very special individuals who are able to kind of transcend that kind of recent national identity issue and then work together. I do want to, we'll put a pin on the Concorde program because we're not going to unpack it in this episode, but we are going to come back to supersonic because I think that features later.
And Concorde is a great case, of course.
Yeah, but what about that was a lot on Henry. What about Roger? What about Roger?
Well, I mean,
What was his
Roger was,
background?
I mean, he was also came from the Sud Aviation and working for the Caravelle program. A wonderful aircraft. Finnair has used that for a long, long period of time, like made it so many different nations. He was in Airbus. He was the technical director, and later worked as the executive VP for engineering, and definitely the guy who was instrumental in making A300 the aircraft
Okay.
that it became. So that's absolutely clear. Also, the fact that Airbus adopted a production philosophy or a methodology where different parts, the major sub-assemblies of aircraft, were produced in different locations in Europe, which was pretty much unheard of.
Mm.
And Roger was clearly the guy who was starting that and putting that together. When we come to the German side, and we have Felix Kracht, who was an aeronautical engineer and test pilot, very much active with the German industry, but then later worked for Dornier and then worked with the Deutsche Airbus, which has always been very important part of the Airbus production, even if many people think that Airbus is French, but that is definitely not true. Felix became the head of production and industrial coordination in the 70s for more than 10 years, and really he was also very much in key position in putting together the work-share system. So what's going to be eventual the roles of the Germans, the Spanish, the French, and then of course I'm in UK. Even if UK government wasn't there, the wing production in Broughton in the United Kingdom has been and continues to be a key element of the Airbus supply chain.
And look, I love how we've given these founders, let's kind of, in inverted commas, given them the kind of their identities, because really Airbus at this point is a political experiment, but very quickly has to become a system experiment, right? Because effectively, in my view, you've got Henry that is the political architect. If he doesn't get the governments to lean in and actually do this, there is no Airbus, right? And then Roger, like he's the engineer's engineer. Like he's got to standardize. He's got to systematize. He's got to get the factory in Toulouse, the factory in Germany. He's got to get them working together. And then you've got to make sure that someone like builds the overall system. This looks like this Felix character, that he's building this system of systems, because otherwise Airbus doesn't get going if you don't have the political support, if you don't have the operational system, if you don't have the vision for the aircraft. Everybody has to bring it together. And there were lots of people involved in Airbus's founding story, but I think these three kind of capture that three sides of the puzzle that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, even if production, of course, was the core idea why this work share arrangement was put together, but it later on it also proved that you just cannot have the amount of engineers for the design phase either. I mean, you have to split the aircraft into portions because there is no single country that has enough aeronautical engineers and structure specialists to actually design a modern aircraft like the A350. It's got to be done in collaboration. And we will get back to this point later on in this podcast. Even if the original logic was production related, but it also proved to be quite successful in the design and sustainment part, where none of the countries could have done it alone. And that's really a key.
And just to do a little bit of foreshadowing for everybody to help them out in terms of the story, we're still in the 1970s. The first aircraft that Airbus produced is the A300B. And 300 is literally number of passengers type kind of mentality. And B refers to the fact that it wasn't the first design they came up with, it was the second. It's a twin engine wide body aircraft. The first flight is in 1972. And it enters service with Air France, their first customer, in 1974. So that's where we are. Airbus isn't a company at this stage. It's something else. What is it? This founding moment, December the 18th, 1970. They don't actually create a company.
No,
they create a consortium?
Well, I mean, it was like a project office.
Project office.
I remember when worked in Toulouse for one summer. The guys in Airbus, it was just a small office somewhere in the sidelines of the Toulouse-Blagnac airport, because it was just the consortium head office. It was like a project office, and the real partners, like Aerospatiale in those days, was really the one who was doing the design, was doing the manufacturing, was doing the supply chain management, was doing the sustainment part, everything. It was done in the Aerospatiale organic organization alongside with all the other aircraft that they were involved in. And they had to start from somewhere, and of course the French are always very clever. They invented a unique form of an organization called a groupement d'intérêt économique, and of course, I mean, probably it was just to confuse everybody else, to not really say and know what it is all about. But this is what Airbus was, and once again, it was a curious choice. But on the other hand, in retrospect, in order to make the Airbus story happen, these were not the only unorthodox steps that had to be taken, because otherwise getting these countries working together would have been impossible. The idea that the Germans would all of a sudden hand over their aviation assets to a French company or vice versa, unimaginable. Unimaginable. 25 years after the Second World War ended. I mean, you don't give your assets to the other party and rely on the goodwill and faith that, okay, everything is going to go well. No, you couldn't do that. So
this agreement that the French and German governments sign in 1970, really, it allows multiple companies to collaborate under one umbrella, let's put it that, without merging, right? It gives them some degree of protection, but it doesn't effectively form a company.
Yeah. And I mean, and you need a friendly face who's going to be taking care of the sales, for instance, and the overall coordination between the industrial operations in these different companies and these different countries. So you have to start from somewhere, and then the founding members was really Deutsche Airbus and Aerospatiale, who both had 50% of the voting rights. And then they had a board of directors, they had the management. I mean, typical organizations of a company, even if it was not a company per se.
And at this point, the UK is not involved. It's a 50-50. Germany, and let's be clear, West Germany, because Germany's not united at this point, and France, not merger, joint venture, for a better word.
But once again, I want to underline the contribution of the British industry was instrumental in the success of the whole story, even if the British government was not involved the same way like the other two governments.
Okay, and this is Hawker Siddeley. They're basically working as a subcontractor to build the wings for this first few planes.
Yeah, the same company that also built the Hawk training aircraft that Finland acquired around those same times. I mean, it was 1977, I think it was, when Finland acquired 50 Hawk jet trainer aircraft, and the company was Hawker Siddeley. Then later on became British Aerospace, and today is known as BAE Systems. So also Hawker Siddeley was very much also in the military side of business.
Very much so. And look, I think it's absolutely fascinating that it's 1970 December that the government signed this deal. This is the structure in which Airbus operates basically for the next 17 years.
Mm.
Yeah, and arguably until 1987, and arguably, actually, it's not until 2001, so 30 plus years later that Airbus, the kind of company, arrives, which I think is amazing that it's operated in this way for so long. Yeah. Which kind of gives both sides, let's call it that, the opportunity to kind of get to know each other, get to work together, build up that shared muscle, that, the operating culture before it actually becomes a company. Really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing which is, of course, also interesting is that when they were working all these times, what happened actually, and you could see that in the Toulouse airport, there were new assembly hangars and other buildings that were built all around the runway in Toulouse, and they were Airbus. So even if that was I hate to use this word, but it was kind of, from the Aerospatiale point of view, those were the boys from the toy department in the very beginning. But later on, they became the dominant force and actually essentially eating up the parents.
But look, all great companies generally start off as toys in some description. Airbnb as a mattress on a floor.
Yeah.
eBay selling, Beanie Baby hats or whatever it is, and then ultimately the challenge is that some companies start off as toys and stay as toys.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's
anyway,
foreshadowing a little bit. Let's go back to the 70s.
Yeah, but
right?
but then again, I mean, even if you are not an aircraft fan as such, it's very important to realize that Airbus was actually in the forefront of innovation, because in 1970, around that time, Boeing 707 and DC-8s were the dominant aircraft that were flying intercontinental flights. And then Airbus comes up with this design that is as large as a DC-8, but twin-engined.
Okay.
So it was really a trailblazer in this respect, even if the ability to fly across major oceans and bodies of water was not allowed in 1970s, but it's still the overall conceptual design of the A300 was very, very much in the forefront. And when you look at the aircraft that are flying today, it even looks the same, whereas the DC-8s and 707s and 747s, that were the other dominant aircraft in those days, they look very different. So the vision of the founding fathers and Airbus, it was very much ahead of its time. And what they ended up doing is that they started with this. The original A300 was a bit larger even than what the actual A300B, and they were using the CF6 engines, the same engines that were used in DC-10s, which was, of course, DC-10 came into market more or less at that same time, a tri-engined aircraft, and in all respects, it was a humble start. It was hardly considered as a threat from the American side, but it started many important steps. And one of the interesting quotes from Roger, who was the CEO at one point, was that we had no money, no organization, and no credibility, but we had conviction that Europe could not afford to fail. And this simple quote, I mean, this is absolutely critical, because this necessity to survive was the reason why these nations and these companies decided to work together.
And they didn't have any money, because the founding capital is, well, it sounds like a big number. It's 100 million francs, which is equivalent to 15 million kind of on that side. And that was really just enough to do the initial studies, the initial designs, probably not even enough to get you a prototype. There really is no money at this stage.
Yeah. But you had, of course, important companies that were your shareholders, stakeholders, that had the money and had the skills and the capabilities to do the things. So it's very important to understand that, yes, it was Hawker Siddeley that was designing and building the wings, not Airbus GIE. It was not Aero, the cockpit or center fuselage, or did the final assembly. It was Aerospatiale. So it's very important to understand that even if Airbus as a separate entity was very weak, there was a lot of industrial power that was behind this entire consortium.
Yeah, and we at this point we start to, whether we're articulating in these words or not, because as you've said, this is really much a project kind of office. We start to develop what we would now look back at and say, this is the Airbus work share system. In France, we've got the nose, the cockpit, the center, the fuselage, the final assembly. In Germany, we're doing the rear fuselage, the forward fuselage section. The UK is doing the wings. And then a little bit later, Spain comes in with the tailplane and the rudder, right? So this becomes a system.
Yes, and I'm sure that in the leadership teams of all these companies that were behind that, they were also prepared for the eventuality that this whole thing will fail. And they were not betting all their money on this specific aircraft type or this initiative. So they were hedging their bets by being very, very active in other fields of aviation at the same time. But then, as we later learn, it was really the little bastard cousin who all of a sudden became the head of the family. I mean, that's how it turned out to be.
Absolutely. And it happens relatively quickly. Not the success, but the first plane. So by October the 28th, 1972, we have the first 800B prototype. It takes off from Toulouse Airport. And I love the fact that it's Henri's son is one of the pilots. This is classic startup territory, like roping the family to do the press release, kids modeling your product, etc. So basically, we have this Declaration of Independence, this science project, as it's dubbed by the Americans, basically takes flight. And really, we also have this, as you said, this quote from Henry at the time as well, which is, we're not asking for faith, we are asking for time. Because at the moment, time and money, they've got the corporation. It's time and money that are the really important ingredients that they need to get there. But the rest of the world is kind of underwhelmed. And when we say the rest of the world, really, we're talking about the Americans. They're not particularly interested at this side. It's just a European science project.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not only the Americans, also Europeans. If you think about SAS, what were the aircraft that SAS was flying, and what were the aircraft that Finnair was flying? Finnair was flying the DC-8s. That was the first transatlantic aircraft Finnair ever had. They were flying with DC-9s. They were an early customer for the DC-10. We had almost exclusively McDonnell Douglas fleet in the early 70s. Not the French, not a British aircraft fleet. So not only the Americans, pretty much the entire airline world was in love with American designs. And it was only the question whether you are in the McDonnell Douglas league or are you a Boeing company. Those were the two genuine alternatives. And for many of these companies, I mean, Airbus hardly existed. And it took, for example, Finnair, it took, I think it was 1986 or something, when Finnair actually bought the first A300s. And they were not part of an elaborate fleet conversion project. There were a couple of aircraft that were originally designed for an Indian customer who didn't buy them in a very awkward configuration, which means that Finnair was able to buy them cheaply, very cheaply, and they were put to charter flights between Finland and Canary Islands and places like that, and painted in the Car Air livery. So that's when the first Airbuses came to Finland, but it was not a strategic, it was a very opportunistic decision from the Finnair management point of view.
And look, I think, again, we're going to paint Airbus as a market category leader in the future. But at this point, we started in 1970. We basically do our first plane in 1972. We get our first customer, Air France, in 1975, probably because the French government told them they had to buy them, right? Let's just be clear. I put my money into this. You better buy one of those planes. But by 1976, we don't have any orders. The Toulouse factory, the little bit of a project toy place that we've created, it's kind of shutting down, right?
There's nothing... I mean, they were active with other stuff. I mean, there were other aircraft in the production line, but indeed that was the case. And I don't have the statistics here, but if you look at the amount of flights flown in entire Europe or the flights flown in United States, there was a massive difference. It was absolutely clear that the aviation business is in United States because the Americans were flying and they were flying a lot. So it was clear that in order to succeed in this marketplace, Airbus had to go to United States. And that's what they did and approached Eastern Airlines, so that was based in Miami. And they were struggling with the high fuel cost like everybody else due to the oil crisis of 1973. And the Air 300 was promising fuel efficiency, which, oh, by the way, is a major element for all airline customers. It's really the operating cost is a key driver for everybody. And if you are able to burn less fuel than the 707s, DC-8s, or even DC-10, which was a 3-engine aircraft, then you may have a case. And then Airbus went to Miami and started to pitch the aircraft. And just to make the sale, they offered 4 A300B4s on a free trial lease for 6 months. If you don't like them, we'll take them back and it doesn't cost you a penny. So, I mean, that was an offer that even Eastern Airlines could not refuse, and gladly they fell in love with the design.
I just love this bit of the story. I just knew nothing about, sadly, Eastern Airlines and what was happening there. I just thought it was a fantastic thing, which was effectively, we ended up with this you only live once deal and the opportunity to enter into the US market. And I love this quote from Frank Borman, from April, the CEO and founder of Eastern Airlines, which is that this whole issue of this is the first airplane I've seen that does what it promises to do.
Yeah, and the other thing is that United States is a big area, and why United States is very, very good in those days for a twin engine aircraft is that you have a lot of destinations, long trips to fly, but you don't have to go across large bodies of water, which for twin engine aircraft in 1977 was very, very restricted. That's why the transatlantic routes were with 4-engine aircraft still those days. Of course, something that changed then dramatically later on. But definitely going to United States, where there are a lot of flights, a lot of airline companies, and long trips, relatively long trips, needing good capacity. I mean, that was really, A300 was a very good fit to that specific market in the late 70s.
And I think this is really interesting because when you look at civil aviation today, you look at the business, leasing is a big part of it. But we're back in 1975, 1976, now 1978 with Eastern Airlines. Leasing doesn't really exist. This is not part of the business plan.
Yeah. It was not. It's actually funny. I remember the years when leasing became an option. I mean, for example, Finnair had several. Finnair bought the first 2 DC-10s were actually acquired, and already the third DC-10 Finnair operated was a leasing aircraft. It was flying with American registration due to the owner being a leasing company. So those were the days when the whole leasing option became, slowly but surely, became an element. And of course, this is an extremely capital intensive business. To find a way to finance other than collecting capital from your shareholders is absolutely fascinating. And therefore, Airbus was in the leading edge. But definitely the whole leasing business became extremely active, starting from the 70s, and then of course gaining a lot of speed in the 80s and in the 90s.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that because I think that this leasing deal then opens up the opportunity for the low-cost carriers later. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. But things change for Airbus. They effectively get some credibility. Eastern Airlines orders 23. This is like the biggest order that Airbus have had to date. And also it changes minds. US regulators, FAA, began recognizing Airbus's certification as a credible equivalent to Boeing's. Pan Am and TWA start sending their technical teams to Toulouse. And the narrative starts to change, right? So we go from a science project, quaint toy, to this is something that's actually able to deliver real fuel efficiencies at a time when the market needs those fuel efficiencies.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing is that whenever you have a single supplier environment, where you have a dominant supplier and the customers are forced to buy from one, it's normal that customers are actually, even if they are relatively happy with the dominant supplier, if there's an alternative, they are very tempted to try something else. And when Airbus was able to demonstrate that they are a serious company and they are producing good aircraft, the temptation of having a second for your air transport concerns, it was very, very tempting. So that's essentially what happened, and of course then by the late 70s and early 80s, the Airbus aircraft were already sold to many places in the entire world. So it became a very successful one. They built a smaller version, the A310, but A310 never really took off. But it was essentially a prelude to the A320 family, which then, of course, became a massive success later on. And that was the story of the 80s, essentially. In the 1980s, when A320 development started and eventually the aircraft was introduced to service.
Okay, But let's not get too far ahead. It's not all up and to the right from this moment on. The Airbus is still super early days. So, but by 1979, after this Eastern Airlines deal, Spain joins the party, right? And so, how does that work?
Well, I mean, Spain, of course, has a very, very bold and valuable aviation history, and they were hang-arounds all this time, but then eventually they became a partner, a smaller one compared to France and Germany, but still consolidated the assets of CASA. And one, of course, interesting element was that when CASA came along, CASA had something that the French and the Germans didn't necessarily have. CASA had tradition in military transport aircraft. It was not something that in the late 70s was dominant, but later on, the military transport side of Airbus has been the hands of the Spanish all these times. There were, of course, changes in the management. And after some of these founding fathers, there was Bernard Latière, who became the managing director of Airbus, and he was really focusing then on the commercial growth and not just surviving. So clearly a new stage of the life of Airbus started, and a systematic sale and business development processes were started.
Makes a lot of sense. But also we have other changes. Henri retires.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's natural.
Yeah. So, people move in and out. We have a number of characters coming into the Airbus thing. It's becoming a little bit less of a science project. Toulouse is starting to expand as a kind of more of an industrial city. And by 1979, Airbus has managed to deliver, and let's just be clear, we started in 1970. We've got 80 aircraft out the door. Over 200 plus firm orders have been gained. We've got our first non-European American customers. And effectively, it's starting to work, but we're still tiny in comparison to everybody else. We have 10%, if we're lucky, if we kind of, stand there in our socks and, squidge up a little bit. We've got about 10% kind of market share. But we're definitely not a rival in any shape or form by the end of the 70s.
Yeah, and then what essentially then shifted. I mean, the whole 70s and the whole A300 and A310 story. It was really a very humble beginning. It was not a revolutionary tale at all. The world was flying with the short-range aircraft, the 737s and the DC-9s, later MD-80s. They were essentially 1960s designs, and what Airbus decided to do is that they wanted to revolutionize the narrow-body market. That's where most of the numbers of aircraft were highest, and that was where they were really all the designs that were available. They were close to 20 years old already, and just refreshed. But none of the single-aisle regional jets were designed from scratch before Airbus came with the A3.
And just take a moment. We use the terms wide body, narrow body, etc. Explain to an air but civil aviation novice.
Well, I mean, the I don't know how to explain that actually. I mean, DC-8s, 707s, they were 6 abreast aircraft. If you go to 737s, they were 6 or 5 abreast. DC-9s 5 abreast, and single aisle in the middle of the aircraft, and that's it. But in order to grow, in order to make a bigger aircraft having more capacity, you had to widen the body, and then you ended up having 2 aisles and then up to 8 or even 10 passengers seating in one row. So it was just a very practical thing, and in order to get to the capacities, you had to reinvent that. But I mean, choosing the right aircraft for the right route is very much dependent on the overall network strategy you have. How many times a day you want to fly? How many passengers can you fly? The whole size of the aircraft is dependent on your strategy, how you want to maintain your network, your constellation of cities, hubs, all that. And it was clear that you need something better than existed for the narrow body, for the let's say, it's more than just a regional market, but in order to bring passengers to the larger hub airports where you have Boeing 747s and alike that are taking people to distant cities. I mean, places like Frankfurt, Munich, Amsterdam, London. You cannot fly a 747 to all the smaller airports, but you can bring passengers from the smaller airports to these hubs, and then they are flying across the Atlantic. And you needed an aircraft, an efficient aircraft, a modern aircraft, and an affordable aircraft to feed these hubs for the 747s and alike to fly passengers all over the world.
And I love the fact that when you look at Airbus's initial order book in the 70s, you have those initial orders from mum and dad, Air France and Lufthansa, but then it's Korean Air that comes in 1976. Eastern Airlines in Miami, 1977-78. Indian Airlines, 1978. Saudi Arabian Airlines, Indonesian Airlines, China's airlines. In fact, it's global from day one, which I had not expected. I thought this was a built in Europe, supported by Europe story in terms of orders. And that is not the case. This is very much a built in Europe, first orders by mum and dad, and then everything else is global from day one.
Yeah, I mean, aviation is by nature a global business. It's a global network of transporting people from place to place, and it's absolutely global in its effect. And yes, there were a number in those days. We had a number of countries and airline companies that were flying with Soviet-made aircraft. So that was the other thing. But let's say they were very different. You could see that these are very different kinds of aircraft, and you very rarely had companies flying both of the Western and Eastern aircraft at the same time.
Now, before we leave the 70s, we didn't get this far, 80 plus planes delivered, on that initial seed capital. That we could only make 100 million francs or whatever it was stretch so far. So at this point, effectively, Airbus is getting these government-backed loans. It's getting this launch aid program, these in-kind contributions. And you set this up beautifully at the beginning that, aviation and governments go hand in hand, right? Whether it's the US Air Force or the French or West German governments, because we're still in the 1970s. So at this point, in the early days, France and West Germany each provide basically about 450 million francs in repayable launch aid. Yeah, they basically have specific milestones that this Airbus entity needs to hit. And ultimately, we're basically getting up to about 2 billion in today's money in terms of support for the A300 program. So there's a lot of initial capital that these governments have to put in to basically get these planes in the air.
But the other thing which is important is that in the very beginning, there were a number of companies a limited amount of companies that were involved, but already with the A20, the ecosystem of companies that were participating in the design, they were design build partners. I mean, subcontractors who were actually responsible for the design, and they were risk sharing. That number started increasing with the A20, and of course has exploded ever since. I don't even know how many risk sharing partners Airbus has in the latest aircraft projects, but it was the financial risk was shared. In addition to the core countries, there were a lot of companies that came from essentially all the European countries, including Sweden and Finland. There were companies that have participated as risk-sharing design build partners, essentially making the design, taking care of the supply chain, building the parts, delivering parts, and providing lifecycle support for the parts. And there are many, many countries that have participated into these. And that was a business model, another business model that Airbus was in the very, very instrumental in bringing. Also, there we are going a little bit too much to the future. If we stick to the late 70s, there is one very important, let's say, pivot point that took place. And that was the whole Boeing 747 story.
Okay.
I mean, when the 747 essentially started dominating the skies in the 70s, that's yet another U.S. government-funded project, because it was actually the U.S. Air Force requirement for CX heavy logistics system that eventually produced the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy. But there were three companies, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed, who had the best initial designs, and they got a contract award of building prototypes. So all these companies are designing the entire aircraft, they are building prototypes for the US Air Force then to see that, okay, I like the middle one, I don't like the other two. But rather than the companies paying out of their own pockets or from the shareholders' pockets these designs, it was US government who ordered the development programs. Exactly the same thing that happened with F-22 or happened with F-35. The same thing. There were several prototypes that were built, and the prototypes were built with US government money before the final contract award, for example, in the case of F-35, went to Lockheed.
And I think that's an important story, because
and yet another thing, because why this is important. Boeing lost this CX heavy logistics system, and they had a design which had, for example, had the cockpit on the second floor. Why? Because US Air Force wanted to have a cargo bay that was open from the front so that you could put heavy cargo in. So the basic design of having two floors in the aircraft was based on the US Air Force cargo handling requirement. And when Boeing lost the program, they just thought that, okay, what are we going to be doing with this? And let's make a passenger aircraft. And that's how 747 was born. And once again, it is fair to say that I don't think that anybody saw the absolute need for a 747 size aircraft in the late 60s, early 70s, and that would not have been developed unless US government had already paid a lot of the development cost as part of the CXHLS program. So,
oh my goodness. So again, it's back to the US government.
Yeah.
Slightly putting a hand on the scale.
Yeah, and the thing is that what it meant is that these projects are the reason why in the 70s and 80s United States was dominating the airliner market.
Very much so. So I think that brings us to the end of part one, which is effectively the birth and the story of the 70s. Now let's move to part two, because this is really America versus the rest of the world, or Airbus versus the American kind of elite. And, great companies are defined by their great rivals, so, whether it's Microsoft's battle with Apple, or Google and Apple, or whoever's fighting the OpenAI and everybody else today, it's these rivalries that often define the business landscape and define the DNA of these companies.
Yeah.
So at this point, entering in the 1980s and in through to the early 90s, it's basically Airbus versus America.
Yes. And in America, predominantly Boeing. I mean, even if McDonnell Douglas was still very, very strong, but it was not financially as strong as Boeing was. And little by little, the star of McDonnell Douglas was flying lower and lower, and Boeing became the dominant player in that field. And of course, Boeing was introducing new aircraft like the 757 and 767 in the early 80s. But what happened, what was essentially what Boeing missed, was the A20 story that appeared in 1987. And Boeing had benefited from some of these military programs quite a bit, whereas Airbus, as such, was very civilian oriented. And it's good to remember that still in the 80s, Soviet Union still existed. The Cold War was in its peak, so there were a lot of money in the defense contracts, which of course shifted when we came to the 90s.
Very much so. And again, let's just compare the size of the two companies. You have Boeing, who in 1980 delivers 400 aircraft, and Airbus delivers a whopping 35. Which is good for Airbus, because remember, it was 80 in a decade, or just under a decade before. Boeing's at around 120,000 employees. Airbus is, just knock off 100 and you're about the right figure. They're at around 20,000 employees. Boeing is profitable. It's got about 10 billion in revenue, which would be, mid-40s today. And Airbus is, probably not profitable. Revenue, certainly under 1 billion, etc., etc. It's a problem. They're very small. It's David versus Goliath, or David versus Goliath's bigger brother at this particular stage. So, but I think what's interesting is again, what's the technological choices or the design choices that these two players make in the 90s that kind of sets them apart?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, I mean, with the 767 that had the first flight in very early 80s, the glass cockpits started coming, and if you think about the electromechanical instruments that were used in aircraft in the 70s, they had a major maintenance burden. In order to keep them up and running, they were mechanical devices resembling more watches and clocks rather than anything easier. So they were very maintenance heavy, and getting to the digital instrumentation, it definitely had an advantage in having less wearing mechanical parts and many things. Now the key things what happened. I mean, A320 was a revolution. That's absolutely sure. And it's probably easier to say how A320 was different compared to anything else.
Okay.
And the core element was that you had a digital flight control system in the A320 that essentially changed the role of the pilot in an instrumental way. Whereas in the 757 and 767, the pilot was still deflecting the control surfaces using a yoke and a stick. I mean, that's the way you call them. And was deflecting the control surfaces, and the control surfaces did exactly what the pilot requested. What happened with the A20 was that rather than deflecting the control surfaces, the pilot was actually asking the aircraft to perform a maneuver, and it was the computerized flight control system that then decided which control surfaces to deflect and how much in order to have the aircraft maneuver the way how the pilot is requesting, and this is a massive difference. It's clear that even with the 767, for example, that had a hydraulically actuated control surfaces, if you lost all the hydraulics, you could not fly the aircraft anymore. That's why you had triple hydraulic systems in the aircraft. The last aircraft that you definitely could fly totally mechanically was DCA.
Okay.
Wires, and the control surface is connected to wires, and there's even a story about when there was a major failure of hydraulic system in a DC-8. It was landed by two pilots by using the all force they had in their feet and in their hands, and they were able to deflect the control surfaces just enough to bring the aircraft down safely.
Oh my goodness.
When you go to larger aircraft than the DC, the physical forces needed to deflect the control surfaces are so big that you have to have a hydraulic system or an electronic system to do all the work for you. So there was a major change. But the idea that you have actually, rather than having your yoke, your stick in an aircraft that is deflecting, what actually ended up that the pilot is having just a simple stick. If you're the captain, you have on the left hand, or the first officer, you have on the right hand. You have a stick that is not even moving. I mean, it's not a joystick that is moving back and forth. It's registering the force with which you are deflecting the stick, but the stick is not moving. So it was a very, very revolutionary in those days, and of course many pilots were heavily against the whole idea.
Of course, change. And also, you're moving from this man in command type.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the difference is subtle, but it's for all the traditionalists, changing the way whether you can rely on the aircraft to do the right thing, or do you rely on the pilot having the supreme understanding on everything that happens any given moment. There's a huge philosophical change. With older aircraft, it was possible that the pilot actually can understand and do troubleshooting while on flight. But it's also very important to understand that actually you are not expecting the pilot to improvise when you are in distress. You are supposed to be taking the checklist that is printing on red pages, and you are supposed to be following that and do not improvise. You follow the book when you're in distress, and it means that, as a matter of fact, the aircraft have become so complex that the pilot cannot possibly understand all the possible problems that the aircraft may have. And you have actually created a machine that is too complex for a single pilot to master as an entire system. So the complexity is driving new ways of controlling the aircraft. And for example, for the glass cockpit, one of the key elements there is that you are trying to minimize the information that is available for the pilot so that you are only showing the data that is important for the work, for the task at hand. So, for example, all the indications, temperatures, pressures, whatever that you don't need, if they are within spec, they remain hidden. If they are out of spec, then you are showing to the pilot that this item needs your attention. But anyway, the key element here is that the digital flight control system adopted in the A320 was a massive change, and it had a lot of resistance in those days, but the benefits were at the same time they were very significant because you reduce the cockpit complexity.
Yes.
You improve the situation awareness when you were eliminating the unnecessary data. You saved weight and maintenance costs massively because really the electromechanical and pneumatic instruments that you had in those old aircraft, they were huge cost items. And then of course what happened, we didn't know that at the time of the A320, but later on what we found out is that you can actually have A320, A330 and A340 and even A350 and A380 that are actually very similar as far as the cockpit is concerned. So the transition from one aircraft to another happens much more quickly. For example, the same pilot that is flying A320 can fly A330 and A340 with minimal extra training. Even if, of course, the aircraft, due to the different size, are behaving to some degree differently because their mass and size is different.
And I think this is a critical one. And again, it's like this, you've spelled out a very clear philosophical difference between the companies and how this then changes into effectively a user experience, pilot user experience, where it has this common cockpit DNA, which enables you to move not seamlessly, but certainly, you're not having to retrain to fly a different vehicle. And ultimately that gives flexibility in the workforce that allows you to cover those cancellations, that allows you to move pilots around and suddenly extrapolate that change outwards. This becomes a big advantage for Airbus.
Yeah. And the other thing is this technology was available. I mean, Airbus actually didn't invent this technology. It was already used in military aircraft. So if you look at the F-18 or F-15, they were using digital flight control systems. I mean, not exactly the same as with the A20, but the idea that you can fly the aircraft differently than the traditional mechanical tradition has shown, it was clear already. And I mean, there's even an interesting video that some of our viewers and listeners have seen. There's a video from the early 80s when the 15 from Israeli Defense Forces had a mid-air collision with another aircraft, and thanks to the digital flight control system, the pilot was able to bring the aircraft down, even if in the collision the aircraft lost one of its wings.
Which I watched the video, it's great watching. It makes no sense. From a physics point of view, I'm like, how?
Yeah.
Literally, when you watch this, there's no wing. Like the wing's gone, right?
Yeah, the wing is gone. But thanks to the F-15 shape, but thanks to the shape of the aircraft, it creates a lot of lift with just its wide body. But the main thing is that if it was the traditional type of a control system, it would have been a no-go. And so it means that McDonnell Douglas, with its F-15 aircraft or F-18 aircraft in those days, already had this advanced flight control systems, but they were not used in the civil airliners before Airbus came with that one.
Because again, when I did the research on this one, I was thinking, okay, this is just the classic incumbent versus disruptor dilemma. Airbus doesn't have a lot of planes. It doesn't have a lot of pilots. It can create a new standard. It's new, so it can adopt the latest technology. That's the disruptor play. I've got nothing to lose. Let's build something new from scratch. Let's reinvent. And the incumbent, I've got people using my stuff. I'm producing 400 planes.
Yeah.
People like what I'm producing. But what you're saying is that's a misreading of. There is a bit of that always in the business story. What you're saying is they had the technology to do this. They actually had and were building those planes just in their other arm of the business. But
Absolutely.
they didn't bring that technology to this arm of the business.
And Aerospatiale was very much in front. I mean, the ATR-42 aircraft, the little propeller aircraft, was using the same ARINC 429 data bus that was used then later on in the A320. And funnily enough, when I was spent my summer in Aerospatiale, the thing that I prepared during the summer was actually a comparison between the MIL 1553 bus and the ARINC 429 bus. So how they were different. That was the task that I had for the summer. So the how should I put it? Even the data bus technology that Aerospatiale and Airbus started using in the 80s, it was more advanced than what was used by typical aircraft manufacturers. But the same thing, if some of you have heard about the CAN bus that is very widely used in vehicle industry, it has the same basic idea. You have a data bus, and then there are a lot of items that are connected to this one bus, and the data is moved in packages from sender to the recipient in the same bus, and it's reducing a lot the amount of wiring needed in the aircraft. It results into a whole lot less points of failure in the actual aircraft. So it's a technologically superior solution, and of course. It was a bold move from Airbus to use it in the A320, and it was a gamble that they won.
And I think this is great. We're getting to the end of part 2. Look at the fortunes of the two companies by 1989, right? So in 1980, Boeing's doing 400 aircraft, Airbus is doing 35. That's the production volumes in 1980. By 1989, Boeing's doing 460 aircraft, like 400 to 460. Airbus, they've jumped. We've gone from 35 to 162. Airbus has doubled their employee count. They've gone from 20,000 to 40,000. Boeing is basically around the same. Revenues for Airbus have basically quadrupled. We're at 6.5 billion today. Maybe we're profitable, maybe we're not. But we've definitely taken market share, right? We're still a consortium. We're not even a company at this stage. But Airbus is moving. It's really made a big jump in the 80s as a company.
And I think it's also important to remember that why was this done? It was not because somebody was in love with technology. It was not because somebody felt that we need to use the latest and the greatest just for the sake of it. It was there to reduce the weight. It was there to reduce the manufacturing cost. It was there to reduce complexity that will result into increased reliability and lower life cycle cost over the entire time the aircraft is used. So they were actually very much design and production oriented elements that have a business reason to be there. They were not there for the aircraft enthusiasts. It was there to make a sound, profitable business in the marketplace where passengers, we are willing to pay less and less and less for the flight tickets.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, it's essentially we are the ones to blame. If there is somebody to blame here, we are the ones that need to be blamed or thanked for pushing innovation in the design and production of major airliners.
Just before we leave the 80s, I do think we need to just draw a line under the amounts of money involved. So at this point, during the 80s, Airbus is still a hungry hippo and consumes about 28 to 30 billion in kind of government debt, launch aid, etc., etc. But again, let's compare. Boeing's getting money from the US government just in a different way. So during the 80s, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, they consume about 135 billion in US grants. Now, these grants or contracts come from effectively the Department of Defense, NASA, DARPA, etc., etc. But it's not nothing that the Americans get at this point. There's a large amount of capital flowing into these businesses, both on the European side and on the American side.
Yes. And still remembering that in the 80s, the Cold War was in full speed, and the defense contracts were large and generously funded. But of course, this all changed in the 1990s.
Exactly. So, part 3, the 1990s, and an awful lot happens. Like if the 80s were kind of slightly up and to the right for Airbus, the 90s are a very turbulent period for aviation, full stop. So we take stock in the kind of deliveries. In 1990, Airbus delivers 95 planes. Boeing delivers 385 planes. Boeing goes up, Boeing goes down. By 2000, so the end of that decade, Airbus is at 311. Like, wow. And Boeing is at 489. So again, we have this huge ramp up on the Airbus size. Boeing goes up, Boeing goes slightly down, but effectively we end in, foreshadow 10 years in, Airbus is in a very different place over this 10-year period.
Yeah, and it's also, it's the ending of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet Union had also one critical impact, and that is the infamous Last Supper that took place in DoD in 1993, when DoD in the United States essentially told the largest defense contractors that we won't need you walls. Downsize, right size, merge, or die away. And that was actually the reason why Lockheed and Martin Marietta went together and became Lockheed Martin. Northrop acquired Grumman Aircraft, became Northrop Grumman, and then eventually in 1997, Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas. So it was actually sparked by the end of the Cold War and the deliberate downsizing on the defense industrial base in the United States. And that was driving. At the same time, what happened was that, of course, the 90s, they were stressful years in places like Finland, clearly because we had a major recession then. But what happened was that overall, the economies were booming. There was a huge amount of increase in air travel. We had a lot of new companies, in addition to the traditional flag carriers. We had many low-cost operators, and A3 proved to be an excellent aircraft. At the same time, Boeing was revising 737, bringing larger and larger and larger engines to the aircraft and trying to maintain competitiveness. So all of a sudden, the true duopoly emerged between Boeing and Airbus, and it happened first and foremost in the single-aisle side. And 737 against 320, and this huge rivalry, first of all, it increased the number of aircraft produced dramatically, but that connected with the leasing business model made it possible for EasyJets and Ryanairs and JetBlues and other low-cost carriers to emerge and seriously start providing the consumers what they wanted, ever dropping air ticket prices.
Absolutely.
So that this is of course a magnificent area.
Yeah, it does. And also in the, we can stretch the 2000s. Like Airbus actually becomes a company.
Yeah,
we've been talking about it for so long, it actually becomes a company at the end of this decade. But before we dive into low-cost carriers, because I think that's a fascinating area, just to explain this 1992 EU-US agreement. What happened up there?
Well, it was in a way almost a non-agreement in the sense that the major significance of that specific agreement is that the fact that the United States wanted to negotiate on this matter is a sign that in the early 90s, eventually the Americans came to the conclusion that Airbus is really a threat. And for the Americans, of course, the idea of direct government subsidy is straight from the evil. It's straight from the devil. And for them, having a blind eye on the defense contracts and the funding that the American aerospace manufacturers are receiving from those contracts is, of course, something it's totally different. It's commercial.
Cool.
So in order to find a truce rather than a trade war that was emerging in 1992, European Union and United States signed a bilateral agreement on large civil aircraft, and it essentially defined what are the allowable and non-allowable mechanisms of support to Airbus and Boeing. And And it's a non-agreement in a sense that it basically described the status quo. It tried to limit the let's say the inappropriate forms of funding in order to maintain an illusion of a competitive landscape. But it's I don't know if it was how effective it was. The status quo remained the same. The European governments were giving
an agreement to kind of almost raise the topic.
Well, I mean,
but rather than resolve the topic.
Well, I mean, it described the status quo.
Yes.
So if you wanted to know what it is all about, if you were wondering that what's happening, you had a document that had documented the mechanisms that were in place. And eventually, 12 years later, in 2004, United States just simply threw the agreement away, and then it, of course, became a WTO issue. But it was really trying to address the, let's say, the non-commercial elements of aviation business and not being able to solve it, only be able to document how things were. And it is absolutely clear that if we compare the American way of supporting companies and the European way, I mean, the European typical mechanism was repayable loans.
Yes.
So those repayable loans were not repaid in the case where the aircraft type did not become successful. So essentially the risk for the success of a new design was outsourced partly to the European governments, which is an asset. I mean, clearly it's helping. But the fact that you are getting money as grants and purchase orders from the US government, I'm sure that many European companies would have preferred to have subsidies the way how the Americans got.
Yeah, I'd like to build my prototype for free.
Yeah.
Thanks.
On the other hand, I mean, we can also argue that some of the challenges that the US government is facing today, where the prime contractors are not investing into new production capacity and new products the way how US government would like to see them do, they are partly due to the tradition that was built decades ago.
Yes.
And that's the reason why now startups who are venture funded are then taking some of those traditional defense prime contractors for a ride, because they are then able to utilize the weak points of the traditional defense industry base for their benefit. So Andurils and all the others who are venture funded and then they are reinventing the defense industrial base, they are partly now taking advantage of those bad habits that were built over the decades.
Absolutely. And we're definitely going to come up to defense in part 4. But let's segue back to the low-cost carriers, because I think this was interesting. We set this up, this deal with Eastern Airlines in 1977, 1978. They order 20-plus planes. It saves, and it's a crazy deal, right? It's like a free lease, right? Commercially suicidal, but gave them the trust and the reputation in the market because the aircraft delivered. Now, wind the clock forward from the 70s, we're in the early 90s. Deregulation opens up the Europe skies. New airlines can now emerge, but they need planes. And they kind of need a particular type of plane. And this is almost the kind of, I'm sure Roger didn't build the A3's 120 family with EasyJet and Ryanair in mind, but this is exactly the plane they need.
Yeah, and I mean let's see it. I mean, you know venture capital very well. If you are a young executive, I mean, there are several executives who have been building low-cost carriers. If you're an executive with a great business idea, it's not easy to get equity investors to an airline company, because traditionally it's been a case that the likelihood of failing is very high.
Yeah,
so why would somebody give money to an airline company? However, if you have, if you are able to reduce the capital expenditures and the associated risks by not buying the aircraft, instead you are leasing them, and you have these companies who are masters in investing money into high capital cost items. The only thing that the leasing company needs to make sure that the aircraft is operated, maintained and overhauled according to the original equipment manufacturer's instructions, so that the resale value in the end of the leasing period is predictable. And of course, the better the aircraft is, the higher the resale value at the end of lease is, the lower are the monthly fees that you have to pay. So in a way, the leasing companies were, I don't know if this is a fair comparison, but the leasing companies were actually having the role of venture capital in a way.
Very much so. I think
And
they set this up.
And it was a huge thing. And I mean, like ILFC, I mean, these huge companies who are investing a lot of money, they had a pivotal role in making airline travel the way it is, to get the prices to the level that we have all enjoyed. So they have had an instrumental role and making it possible that you don't have to be a government-owned flag carrier to be able to start a new airline company.
Yeah, and this is where you see those quick turnaround, fuel efficient, pilots able to train very quickly and jump on different aircraft. This is all a precondition to low-cost prices, low-cost carriers.
And I hate to get back to the previous chapter, but I need to say, if you have all these electromechanical and pneumatic instruments in your aircraft, once they've been flying for 5,000 hours, you know that their reliability is going to be less than what it was on day one, which means that there's a huge amount of maintenance and repair that will be needed so that the aircraft can fly another 5 or 10,000 hours. And having a more digital version of the aircraft, having less need for these clocksmiths to repair them, and the amount of value that is lost during your leasing period and your residual value remains higher in the end of lease period, which means that it's going to cost you less per month to use it. And then all of a sudden, the low-cost carriers definitely want to take the aircraft that is giving them the best bang for the buck.
Yeah, and it becomes all about the economics for these guys. You know, they
Absolutely.
live and they die on their kind of seat margins.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting when we looked back at the technological chases or the philosophical choices that Boeing and Airbus had made back in the 70s and 80s, we end up on this concept of this paired design. This came a lot of it in the research. Just explain the concept of the paired design.
Well, I mean, the paired design was probably, you are referring to the A330, A340.
Yep.
And that gets to the ETOPS that we've been talking about already earlier. The how much you can use the twin engine aircraft over large bodies of water, and it's really the A330, A340 was a case that there were, at the time of design, there were many areas where you actually needed a 3 or 4 engine aircraft, and those aircraft are inherently going to be consuming more fuel than the twin engine aircraft. So by essentially having both of these options in your assortment, you were hedging your bets against, because you could not be sure which one will be more successful. You build both of them by having as much commonality as possible between the two versions. And then, of course, what happened is that the ETOPS requirements, slowly but surely, they became more forgiving. And I mean, what does ETOPS mean? Essentially, I mean, there's another way of expressing it, and it is engines turn or passengers swim is the colloquial way to refer to that. And if you have, for example, if you have ETOPS 300, it means that the aircraft is agreed to fly for 300 minutes, which is 5 hours with only one engine. Or if you have, I mean, some aircraft even have ETOPS 360. It means that you can fly 6 hours with one engine.
That's a long way.
I mean that's crazy. I mean, in the early stage of ETOPS, it was 60 or 120 minutes, then it was 180 minutes. But just imagine the feeling when you're a passenger and the captain says that, I'm sorry to say we've lost one of our engines, but don't worry, the nearest airport is another 5 hours away. But that's what it means. That's what it means. And when the aircraft manufacturers, the reliability of the engines, and then the aviation authorities essentially agreed that you can fly these extreme distances with one engine, then essentially the 4-engine aircraft became pretty much obsolete.
And I think this is fascinating. You know, you have this paired design between the A330, A340, where 80% of the structure, cockpit, and systems is the same. right? So it's an insurance, it's a hedge just in case these rules change. Airbus spends about 3.5 to 4 billion developing this system. And at the same time, Boeing's spending about 7 billion just on one aircraft, right? So Airbus has really driven a huge cost efficiency at this point. And then when the ETOPS regulations change in the mid-80s, they kind of just phase down the 4-engine version, and it all becomes about the 2-engine.
Yeah. And I mean, Finnair has been flying with A340s not so long ago, but that was clearly an inferior aircraft compared to the.
Okay, so we've made a great choice. It's played out really well for us. But let's just go across the Atlantic, hopefully not on a single engine. What's happening to Boeing at this stage, right? Because at the moment, it feels like Airbus made this great choice around this paired design. That, the fly-by-wire system was fully matured. The low-cost carriers are starting to order. Things are looking good for Airbus in the 90s. Where are we with Boeing? They do this merger, takeover, acquisition, whatever, with McDonnell Douglas. How did that happen?
Well, I mean, it's of course there are many reasons. First of all, Douglas had to merge with McDonnell. I think it was year 67 due to extreme market success. They had more orders that they could deliver, so they had to merge with McDonnell Aircraft, and that's how McDonnell Douglas became to life. Then when McDonnell Douglas came with DC-10 and then later on MD-11, they were contemplating building a double-decker called MD-12, and when the board of directors of McDonnell Douglas turned that down, they were considering another design, MD-XX, which didn't go forward. Essentially, what happened to McDonnell Douglas, they didn't have money, they didn't have backing from the board of directors, not from the shareholders, to renew their fleet. Okay. So their story actually ended due to the fact that they didn't have the funds to invest to the future.
Okay.
And let's remember we had the infamous Last Supper 4 years before. So the story was that merge or die.
Yeah. So just die.
And then in a way it made sense. I mean, McDonnell Douglas had defense programs, was very strong in defense. The whole story of fighter aircraft, McDonnell Douglas was very strong with them, with F-18s, for example. And it kind of made a lot of sense. It was supposed to be a merger of equals, but it was a takeover. And I know this very well because I was actually stationed in Boeing office or McDonnell. I went to work in McDonnell Douglas offices in 1996, and then while I was there, the company turned into Boeing. So I saw that from inside, and there were clearly poor decisions done by the management of McDonnell Douglas that led into the bad conditions, and it's a long story. There are a lot of side stories that I could go through, but it is clear that it was a big merger of two giant companies, and indeed it is also true that there was a lot of bean counting that took place. But rather than blaming Harry Stonesheifer for that, I'd like to underline that in the end of the last century, all aircraft manufacturers, including Airbus, including Northrop Grumman, everybody, they realized that the old way of producing aircraft is not going to cut it. And there were a lot of lessons that were learned from automotive industry or from the telecom industry. The companies took, for example, Lean Six Sigma methodology very much into use. And I've been to Northrop Grumman in El Segundo, California. I've seen the C&D Hornet production line for the rear fuselage before they adopted lean management, and I've seen it afterwards. It's a day and night difference. And it's to cut the cost in order to reduce the waste that is not contributing to anything. So many of those changes that took place, and yes, indeed, Harry Stonesheifer was one of the guys who was in charge of those, and in McDonnell Douglas side, those changes were necessary and they were equally done on the Airbus side. But then some of these challenges that were not necessarily as well thought through, that, for example, that the Boeing headquarters was taken away from Seattle and it was put to Chicago, where the management was very far away from the actual production.
Okay.
That was not taken kindly by the employees, and if you are not where the actual value added is taking place, you're gonna distance yourself and you start looking at the numbers. It's clear that remembering what Aerospatiale was in the 80s, people were committed to the company. And the company was committed to the people. And the more we started having, let's say, MBAs and CFOs running companies, at some point you start treating people as numbers rather than understanding that a company and its ability to build aircraft is very much dependent on the people. In addition to the few founders that we have mentioned, there are thousands of critical people who have committed their whole professional life to work in this industry and work in this company. And for example, when a gentleman called John McDonnell was still in the board of directors of McDonnell Douglas, I mean, they came up with an idea that essentially everybody was laid off and you had to apply your job.
Okay.
And of course that's been done by many other companies. But the thing is that when essentially the company is treating you that way, that okay, you are now all fired and you can apply your previous job or you can apply for another job that you feel is more appropriate for you. It created a chaos and it essentially broke the tradition of mutual trust between the employer and the employees. And this is a story that I heard from a heritage McDonnell Douglas employee, said that the specific point was one of the critical points when things at McDonnell Douglas started going to let's call it, started going downhill.
I think this is great insider information. I think there's the challenge here. Wall Street is obsessed with shareholder value. Basically, this becomes a kind of numbers game. You know, you move away from the factory floor, you're in the ivory tower of the accountancy space. Boeing swallows McDonnell Douglas in a $13 billion stock deal, and ultimately they have to do a lot of manufacturing improvements, so does Airbus, but Airbus doesn't get weighed down by this huge merger, and this huge culture clash and this culture churn, as you described it. Airbus slips through the gap on this one because they've already done their collaboration coordination thing at this stage. They've got hiccups to come. You know, we don't want to foreshadow too much. They've got their own problems coming. But at this point in the late 90s, this is a big problem for Boeing and McDonnell Douglas.
Yeah, and I mean, and Airbus really suffered in the 70s and in the 80s. I mean, they went through these teething problems then, whereas Boeing McDonnell Douglas merger took place in the late 90s.
Yes.
So the same cultural changes, reinventing yourself, reinventing your new corporate identity. I mean, it's the same thing that the Airbus people had already done and continue to doing. I mean, the whole was, of course, one thing, but still in the 2000s when EADS was born on the Airbus side, another set of these cultural reinvention cycles where you have to recreate your identity as a company. I mean, it's normal in business.
Absolutely. And I think that brings in the great place, because we need to introduce EADS. But we also need to explain that at this point, even though Airbus is super successful and Boeing, McDonnell Douglas is having a bad time of it, Airbus is still not a company. We're still a consortium. And one of the problems with that is that it's actually struggling to raise capital. Because not from the governments per se, but from banking financial capital pools. So there is a challenge here that the dream of Airbus is working, but the financial and political machinery is slowing things down. So we now introduced a few interesting characters. So Martti, what on earth is EADS and what happens with this organization called Matra?
Before EADS, there was the merger between Aerospatiale and Matra that took place in the late 90s. And Matra is a company where in the early 60s, Jean-Luc Lagardère became the CEO. I mean, he didn't establish the company, but he became a CEO. And then he built a very, very successful defense business. So there's all kinds of handguns, anything under the Matra name, or there were Manourin, for example, one of the subsidiaries. For example, they built the anti-tank weapons and all kinds of things, but very predominant. But the big difference is that Aerospatiale was a government-owned company. Matra was a privately owned company. So there were two massively different corporate cultures that got together. So even if it was considered to be a merger of equals, it is clear that Matra was actually taking over Aerospatiale, a major achievement, and that helped quite a bit the history. Now that was not enough. We had the DASA, which was the German aerospace conglomerate in Germany, and then CASA in Spain, and to bring all these together, the Aerospatiale Matra merger was just a prelude for the actual big thing that took place in year 2000, when EADS, the European Aeronautic Defence and Space Company, was established. And this brought a lot of defense-related assets to the family, both from the CASA side, but also from the German side. And of course, there's been all kinds of defense-related things on the Aerospatiale side. One of the things, for example, being the Eurocopter, which was a European helicopter company, where there were the helicopter assets of Aerospatiale and DASA had already been merged earlier. But even Eurocopter was not, of course, all the helicopter business in Europe. We had Agusta and we had Westland helicopters in United Kingdom. So there where the helicopter business was also having all kinds of players still. But now we had EADS, and many people involved with the merger said that this is a mission impossible, but we still need to do it. And that was a massive thing. Airbus, of course, being just one part of the merged company, but this was huge, and what it meant for the Lagardère family is that whereas they were let's call it a medium-sized player still in the mid-90s, all of a sudden they own shares of EADS and have a board seat and everything. It's a marvelous story.
We go big time now. We go from who's these people to this is a household name.
Yeah, and the key element is that when in the merged Aerospatiale Matra and EADS, it's actually the Matra people who little by little replaced the Aerospatiale heritage people in the key positions. So EADS became very much driven by Matra style of management that was much, how should I stronger way of managing a company than the government-owned Aerospatiale ever had.
Okay.
So this is a massive story, and of course it was not easy, because when EADS was established, once again merging French and German assets big time, it meant that of course the Germans had huge difficulties in accepting it, and the French the same thing. And essentially what happened was that they had two co-CEOs, they had co-chairs, one from Germany, from France.
And they still feels political experiment at this point if we're doing that.
And even two headquarters. I mean, the official headquarters was in Paris on Rue de Montmorency, which was the original Aerospatiale headquarters. But I remember getting phone calls from Munich saying that this is this and this, calling from EADS headquarters in Munich.
Of course.
Because it's funny how they felt, but it is clear that from the very beginning in the inside dynamics, Matra people had more saying than the Germans ever had, or the Aerospatiale people. So that's what happened. One of the reasons why this single corporate entity Airbus had to be built was that the child had become so big that the governments no longer could even finance it. I mean, it was necessary to build one single consolidated corporate entity because it had just become so big and successful. In the beginning, the governments were able to play the fathers and mothers of the company for the very simple reason that we were still talking about small money. But coming to the 90s, the 2000s, not anymore. I mean, the company had become huge.
Absolutely. But Matra doesn't just bring this kind of capital and confidence. It brings a bit of a complexity. This gives Airbus a migraine. There's a big headache coming.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the big headaches is that, of course, Matra was very defense-oriented. In EADS corporate structure, it's actually the international marketing was done under EADS International, which was pretty much run by Matra people. Even their office in Rue Laurent Pichat was in the same building complex where you had Lagardère offices. So they were clearly having challenges. Airbus was trying to take some distance away from EADS International and on the all the defense side of EADS, and it's a very problematic relationship in many respects. It is absolutely clear that when it comes to the business units of EADS, when they are approaching customers in distant countries, EADS International was like their internal sales agent. They had to pay a retainer for their services on a monthly basis, and then a success fee from the sales that they make in foreign countries. And very much driven by Matra people, and partly because in 2003, I think, was when Jean-Luc Lagardère died. In 2001, I think it was when Arnaud Lagardère, the son, took over the Lagardère empire. And his schoolmate, Jean-Paul Gutt, was actually running the EADS International. So it had a huge influence everywhere. And they were pretty successful. But at the same time, Airbus was huge. And when we remember that in these days, I mean, early 2000s, the Cold War had stopped 10 years before. We had entered an era of peace. There was no need for militaries anymore. The defense business, it was in the same moral enclave as alcohol, tobacco, and adult entertainment. I mean, people wanted to distance themselves from the defense and defense industry. And at the same time, from the EADS corporate point of view, Airbus was by far the biggest business unit. By far.
That's where the money is.
That's where the money is. And it is absolutely clear that focusing on making that even bigger and even stronger made strategic sense when you think about the world in early 2000s. And we didn't know what's going to happen in 2014 or 2022. And I think one of the problems that EADS had was that for the French government, it was too German. And for the German government, it was too French.
Only in Europe can you say that.
Only
I love
in Europe.
it.
And when you have companies like Safran, or you have companies like Thales, they were genuinely French companies. So for the French government, they were the domestic companies. And EADS was this kind of a funny company that is organized somewhere else. And one of the critical things was that defense electronics was a pivot point for EADS. It was too small to really make a difference, but they didn't want to invest into building it to significant size. And for example, the French company Sagem was an independent company still in those days, but eventually it was acquired by Safran. And then EADS was left with the small and not strongly growing defense business. And through various iterations, of course, EADS Corporate then later on adopted the name Airbus to represent the entire corporation. So it kind of made sense in those days, and probably it was the right choice for them.
Yeah, and I think, again, we're going to come to defense in a little bit more detail later, but again, I think there's an overall narrative here that we do need to paint, which is Airbus is started in a time of peace where Europe is trying to work together to basically enter the civil aviation market as a combined entity. It has its period. It goes global from day one. And at this point in time, Matra, etc., peace is still very important. Defense isn't the thing that they want to scale the capability that Europe needs. It's still about coordination. And it's about getting bums on seats and flying them places. And that brings us to the A380 story. So the A380, and again, remember, I'm not a plane buff, but the A380 is huge.
It is.
Why? And again, this is the early 2000s, and I think we need to look at this as very much a kind of, this is a business decision, not so much of a plane decision. It's a business decision born on, if the world's airports are congested, low-cost carriers are chucking more people into the skies every one point in time, won't we just need a bigger aircraft?
Well, not only that. I mean, let's remember the biggest aircraft in the marketplace was Boeing 747, and Boeing was still developing new versions of it. And when the design was started, you still could not, due to the ETOPS regulations, you could not fly across all the waters with twin engines. So it kind of made sense. And this hub and spoke philosophy for having these large airports and then smaller airports feeding traffic to them, it kind of made a lot of sense. And challenging Boeing with the the largest aircraft also made a lot of sense, because this is also the era before A350 and a B7 Dreamliner. So this is the generation before, and of course the cost of seat mile was a key criteria, and at the time of design and at the time of delivery, A380 was the cheapest seat mile possible, which is very much in line with the need of getting cheap flight tickets, because us consumers want to fly as cheaply as possible.
That.
At the same time, we had Emirates that was willing to have larger aircraft in order to accommodate the luxurious first class amenities for their customers. So they were really in the pursuit of having showers and bedrooms and all kinds of things, because their clients were asking for those luxury elements, and the A380 was a great platform for that. So that's the logic.
Yeah, no, it's logical. Why doesn't it work? Because it doesn't work.
Well, I mean, in a way it worked. But the challenge was that rather than having this hub and spoke philosophy, for the customers preferred direct point-to-point flights, and you can't have an aircraft of A380 size to point-to-point contacts, just for the very simple reason that you need to have a specialized airport infrastructure to support boarding and unboarding people from two decks. So it was by design reserved for aircraft that was specifically equipped to handle A380. So that was one of the things. The other thing is that the Dreamliner 787 and then the A350, they came so early. I mean, they both have a carbon fiber fuselage. They are lighter, they are cheaper to fly, and actually they kind of eclipsed the A380 early on by providing the point-to-point flights and yet cheaper seat mile costs. So in a way, it was eclipsed that way, and that just resulted into the sale of A380s not increasing the way it was expected. There were many airline companies who were using it, but actually the final nail in the coffin was actually the COVID pandemic.
Okay.
Because that's when the international air travel collapsed dramatically, and that's when the aircraft manufacturers had to lay off people and they had to downsize their operation. A lot of existing purchase orders from airline companies were cancelled. And then, of course, they had to think that what are the areas that they save, which they will let go. And A380 was just one of those aircraft that was let go. And even if today we know that, for example, Emirates is considering having new engines for the A380 and continue flying it for a long period of time. But it's unfortunately, the production was already halted, and it is highly unlikely that it will be restarted.
Yeah, and again, look, I described A380 has gone wrong, but ultimately A380, I got this quote from somewhere, it's almost like an expensive MBA for Airbus, because actually it forces us a lot of system changes, the sort of changes that you were talking about with McDonnell Douglas and Boeing earlier. They had to modernize their then systems, and this actually really sets them up to becoming a platform company, so classic venture capital, we love a good platform on that side. But Airbus starts to become this platform and data place where we have this system introduced in the early Skywise. Now, Skywise for me, it could be drawn as a evolution of what's gone before, the fly-by-wire, the paired design, etc. Or it's revolution. This is a real jump forward for Airbus. Talk about Skywise, because this seems to now become a very big lever for Airbus.
Well, I mean, of course, that's something that many hardware manufacturers have been adopting. Very early on, it was found out that the maintenance, repair, overhaul is one of the key earning models of an aircraft and engine manufacturer. But the big thing is that when engines and aircraft become digitally controlled, they are able to collect a lot of data. And Rolls-Royce is one of the primary manufacturers who's been using the collected data very successfully for a very, very long time. And they were probably one of the first ones who were taking all that data into use. So when was it 15, 16, somewhere that time when Skywise was put together with Palantir? It was a business model that was already in use before by the engine manufacturers. But the point is not data in itself. The point is that if you are the OEM, that is the original equipment manufacturer who has the design authority for the aircraft and its systems, if your earning logic is based on sale of aircraft and spare parts, you don't have any incentive of making the aircraft better, because you cannot
sell it.
You cannot buy spare parts from the hardware store on the way home. You have to buy them from the original equipment manufacturer in most cases. The change in the business model was actually first the engine manufacturers, but also then many of the aircraft manufacturers are offering you power by the hour.
Yep.
That is, you are actually paying for the use of the asset rather than for the owning of the asset. Which means that, for example, the engine manufacturer can agree a price that is cheaper than the earlier business model for the airline customer. And once they have a monthly fee or they have an hourly fee that, okay, this is how many euros it's going to cost you when you operate the engine for 1 hour. When that is fixed, all the improvements that the engine manufacturer is doing for the hardware so that it lasts longer and it has less maintenance or has less downtime from operation is actually in the engine manufacturer's interest. So they are willing to redesign the parts that are not performing in order to reduce their own cost, because their top line remains at the agreed hourly fee. And the same thing, of course, can be applied for the aircraft. And what Skywise is bringing, it brings the data for Airbus to start using availability-based or usage-based business model as a part of their offering.
Yes.
And it's, I mean, the same thing. Kone does that for elevators, or Konecranes does that for cranes, or Wärtsilä does that for engines. So I mean, everywhere you have this manufacturing companies are very much into the services side. The key here is that the traditional price with which the OEM has sold the spare parts, it's been ridiculously high. The margins are massive.
Yeah.
So if you think about the maintenance, repair, overhaul business models, it's not about being efficient in the maintenance man hours. It's actually about who has the control over the price of the spare parts. And these availability-based models, the power by the hour and equivalents, they are clever from the end user's point of view, because they are putting the incentives to the incentives for the OEM to the right place. And in order to manage this whole thing, you need a data system like Skywise. So the Skywise is an enabler for modern earning logics and availability-based sustainment agreements and solutions. And when we know at the same time that the network of partners, risk-sharing partners, and manufacturing partners is large to begin with, it is very, very understandable that a company like Airbus wants to consolidate that information to something that they can monetize. And if there is a company who can help doing that, it's Palantir.
Absolutely. And I did love the fact when we did the research on this, by 2024, systems launched in 2016, 2017. Over 11,000 aircraft use basically the Skywise system. Now, there isn't 11,000 Airbus, right? So there's a lot of Boeing planes basically utilizing the Skywise system. That's right. There's a lot of owners of Boeing planes, using the Skywise system as well. This seems to have given Airbus a real network effect advantage.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And the reason why Airbus is the company who invented that, it's probably that the whole company started as a network of partners. So it's part of their DNA to be networked, and they've had their teething problems. We know that. Sure. It's been a disastrously difficult at times to work with other nations. But even if it probably felt at times it felt impossible, when you just soldiered on and made it work, now they can reap the benefits.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so let's leave Skywise up aside. Let's go back to one of the threads that's appeared throughout this podcast, this question around DNA and defense. So is it as simple that effectively Airbus was born into peace? We needed peace. We were all about collaboration. Even the introduction of the Matra DNA, the defense guys, didn't really change anything because the economics were so much so about the civilian side of the business. And even though Europe needs more defense muscle today, it's not really been in Airbus's DNA in most of its journey, probably until this point. Is that too simplistic?
I think it is, because I mean, many all through these years there's been military programs, and it's very difficult to separate the defense from civilian aviation because they are so much interlinked. I mean, the good old used to manufacture parts for the launchers, and both for the ballistic missiles that are used for delivering nuclear weapons. I mean, that's pretty deep in the defense domain. 400M Airbus helicopters, the way it's called today, clearly serving a lot of military customers all over the world. So they have all that. They are a shareholder in MBDA, which is a leading missile supplier, and now, of course, they have this very recent announcement of collaboration with Leonardo.
Yep.
And Thales concerning space activities. So they are consolidating rather than being. I think Airbus proper is very much excelling in producing large aircraft.
Okay.
And I think that the other elements, be that MBDA, be that the new space company that they are establishing, or anything else, it's a question of unfinished consolidation of European defense and aerospace industry.
Okay.
And it is, and I truly think that it is in a way wise that even if there are links, and there continue to be links in ownership, it still makes a lot of sense that you have industrial entities that are focusing on something that they can be great at, that they can be category leaders in, and being too much obsessed with defense as such. Just do what you're great at. Try to be the best. I mean, that's if you read Peter Thiel's From Zero to One, even he was talking always about being the world-class leader in whatever you attempt to do, and trying to get into defense because it's popular, because it's critical at the moment. I think they can serve also the defense side by being great at what they do. And that really remains the thing. And they are still a player behind the scenes. They are a player in MBDA. They are a player with all these others. So I think we in Europe need to be even less selfish than what we are today, and try to consolidate our industries to be best in each of the categories we're active.
Completely agree. I do think it's worth noting for those on the numbers, but that by the mid-2010s, Airbus's revenues, 80% is from civil aviation, 15 to 20% is from the kind of defense type areas. Okay, changing tack. Why aren't we going fast? Like literally aircraft speeds, jet engines, etc. We talked briefly, we said we put a pin in, not to explain it, but let's talk about supersonic, right? You know, at the moment, where are we with Airbus and Boeing on this area? Because it's been a while before, outside the military, that we've actually flown fast.
Well, that's a great question. Whether supersonic flight will return, it's totally depending on the customers. What are the customers valuing in the end? We know that the wealthy individuals and major corporations, rather than them pushing faster speeds, what they are actually pushing is that they want to have their private jets. They want to save the time from avoiding the queues at the airports rather than trying to speed up the flight. Of course, we are all aware of these companies that are trying to do a supersonic flight like Boom Supersonic. It's the technical challenges of flying supersonic. They are nothing to underestimate. And the thing is that even if somebody would be able to build an aircraft that flies supersonic, the question is very much, and this is the bet that anybody who is involved with those industrial projects need to take. Are we willing to pay what it takes to fly? And is the time saved in the flight valuable enough to justify the cost? Because in the end, it's about the cost. And the key thing is how much is going to cost to actually develop an aircraft that can be civil certified to fly passengers. I mean, we are talking about massive amounts of money. And if you're a venture capitalist, you of course want to recoup your money in a relatively short period of time. I mean, what is the typical time that a venture capitalist holds a company?
So
5 years?
most funds return over a 7 to 10 year period if you're lucky. And obviously, the fund is itself deployed over this 3 to 4 year period. So effectively, and obviously, some venture capitalists, certainly the earlier stage, tend to sell on to the later stage. So some people buy and hold all the way through, but a lot of people have a relatively short holding period. That's if the company's going up and to the right.
Yeah. And it's so difficult to say what's going to happen. It is fair to say that if somebody would have told me in 2002 that there's an Elon Musk who is sending rockets to space and the rockets are landing after use successfully, I would have told that person that you're out of your mind. So definitely whatever we feel today may not be an accurate representation of the future that we will see in 10 or 20 years. But my biggest question for supersonic passenger flight is why is it needed? Because the technical challenges of making an aircraft fly that fast safely, the challenges continue to be there. And the question is that how much the ticket is going to cost, and is the cost justified by the speed that you save or the time that you save by using that flight? You still can't fly supersonic over continents. You only do that over the oceans, and we know that actually the private jets are the preferred mode of travel for the high net worth individuals and corporations. That's the way how they are saving time, that they have the point to point.
Yeah, and I think
point
again,
travel,
if you're
that's really the point.
Yeah, if you're going to deliver supersonic, and I think if people are interested, look at Boom Supersonic, look at Astra Mechanica earlier stage. What they're selling is not tickets on seats, it's very much hours back to people. And obviously what they have to deliver isn't just the supersonic flight, they have to deliver on the airport infrastructure. Landing this supersonic plane at a private airfield close to where you want to be. So I think, supersonic for me is a really interesting area because, again, there is the question of it's the disruptor versus the incumbent who will probably do the running in this space. That's kind of logical. It's kind of high risk, high reward sort of territory. So this sort of evolution or revolution probably won't come from Airbus or Boeing.
No, it won't.
It won't. So, but before we finish the podcast, before we finish and wrap up on Airbus, let's just finish off with Boeing. 2025, part 5 of the podcast. Boeing could describe as the giant with tired wings. That would be possibly a bit cruel, but effectively it's 66 billion in revenue, 157,000 employees. It's produced 350 aircraft. Numbers go up, numbers go down, as you've seen over the years. But in the last year, it lost 12 billion. They had the 737 MAX crisis that cost them 20 billion. They've had a bunch of CEOs come in and say, we're going back to engineering excellence, Martti, what's your take on Boeing today?
Well, I'm very much of the opinion that, it goes anywhere in your life that you are not as bad as how it feels on a bad day, and you are never as good as it feels at the day of success. So definitely we shouldn't underestimate Boeing. Boeing is not a bad company, even if they've received a lot of unfortunate press due to issues that are there for a reason. But it doesn't mean that Boeing is a bad company at all. It's definitely a company that can recover from those challenges, and it's totally dependent on how they choose to run the company. It has tremendous assets, it has a beautiful and very respectable history, tradition, and knowledge. It's only a question that what are the strategic choices that you make from now on, and And in a way, I would say that when you've been challenged, it kind of takes the edge away from your self-confidence, and it's only healthy that sometimes you get some snaps on your fingers rather than having it well always. I think
Absolutely.
in a way I would feel that Airbus is even bigger danger of suffering, because when you are so successful as you are, you become a blind for the amount of luck that actually has helped you to victory. Boeing is definitely a player, and what happens in the future defense programs will very much determine how the future will shape up for Boeing, and it's very much dependent on how the companies run, what are the strategic choices that they make. There's definitely room for a company like Boeing in the marketplace, and I would hate to see them decline from where they have been and where they are today. We definitely need them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, again, I go back to great companies are often defined by great rivalries. And actually, almost the easiest way to ruin a business is to not have any competitors, not have any rivals. It's very difficult to then keep your edge and not let hubris kind of set in. So let us finish the podcast with this land the plane section. Sorry, dad joke included. So we started this episode. I thought Airbus was clearly the category leader in civil aviation, right? They've got now 60%-ish market share. Boeing's at kind of 40% market share. But the more we've dug into Airbus, and I've been massively impressed by the company, the research that we've both done on this, I kind of come to the conclusion that yes, they are the category leader in civil aviation, but they're also a category leader in systems integration. Like, they've really built an amazing system. And ironically, I don't think we celebrate this enough. They've done it across European countries. Yeah. In Europe, where, listen to Americans every day saying Europe's don't work hard enough. And, everybody wants to go home at 3:00 and you guys don't build big businesses. And yet here we are. We have bits of the plane built in different areas. We have a global sales force. We have a platform company that doesn't just support Airbus planes, it supports aviation, full stop. Actually, I think that they are a category leader in civil aviation and a category leader in systems integration. And they've done it all here in Europe, which is very impressive.
And the other thing that I'd like to add there is that there are two critical elements of any business. The first one is the customer. Always listen to the customer. That is so important. But also, when we talk about challenging technical products and services, you need to be able to attract the best talent. It's so much about the people you have. The history of Airbus or Boeing, it was based on people committing their entire professional career to one industrial segment or even one company. The question is that how committed your employees are today for the stuff that you have at hand. And the future, the same goes for Boeing as well as Airbus, is that if they are able to attract the best talent and motivate them to go the extra mile rather than going back home at 4 p.m., they can do miracles. Yes. But I'm not always sure whether the management really understands the importance of competence and skills rather than just appearing enthusiastic. Because there is so much moral posing these days that enthusiasm and actual competence, both are needed, but they are not interchangeable. So you need both. So the future will be so much about whether you are able to keep the people. And one unrelated example is that TSMC in Taiwan.
Yep.
They built a factory to Arizona. In 2024, they had $440 million or the loss. And the reason is that even if they have the same machinery as what they have in Taiwan, even if they have the same process instructions, they have Taiwanese guys who are in the leadership of that factory. They are not able to transfer the skills and knowledge and motivation of the people to the Americans. So it's the loss is due to the personnel not being able to fulfill the role of their people in Taiwan. So it's the same thing here. It's totally dependent on whether you are able to get your people to do the work that needs to be done because none of the stuff that these companies do is simple. It's very complicated, and you need actual competence and motivation to do your very best.
Yeah, and again, the last thing I want to see is Airbus or its supply chain iterate some of the practices that you've seen in America recently or over the past decades. The mass layoff as a just way of basically changing the quarterly earnings. But
Yeah.
I did like the fact that you landed with TSMC, and that brings us into our next category leader. So next month, we're going to be exploring the German company, Zeiss. Now, if people are unfamiliar with this company, they are, again, another category leader based in Europe, best in the world. And they start their journey in optics and glass. And, if Airbus gave, altitude, Zeiss gives it focus. So, Martti, what are you excited about to dig into with Zeiss?
Well, I have several Zeiss products myself. So
Always good to start with the customer.
I love the company, and of course the reason why we're interested in that company. There are many other optical companies that are very important, but Zeiss is active in defense, and of course they are in the supply chain, in the critical supply chain, in one of the most important components in our modern life, and that is the semiconductor manufacturing equipment that is produced by ASML in the Netherlands. They are using Zeiss optics. And there's nobody in the world that can do better machinery than ASML currently. And the best semiconductors in Taiwan or elsewhere in the world are produced by ASML products using Zeiss optics. Yeah. So if there is something that is critical in the and enabler of our modern life, our lifestyle, our values even, it's companies like Zeiss and ASML.
Exactly. And again, one of the stories that I loving to unpack with Zeiss is this British Germany World War I trade, and how effectively in the middle of World War I, we hate each other, we're killing each other in the fields of France. Britain and Germany end up doing this kind of like, hey, you need binoculars, we need rubber, any chance? Kind of deal, which again, how much of the product landed on either side? It's not clearly known. No. What is known is that I know we're at war, but there was definitely conversations around, I need rubber for hose and tires. Yeah. I need glass for basically periscopes and binoculars and sniper rifles. We're the only two people in the world that have got this stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, well, one thing always to remember is that there's nothing that can prevent the enthusiastic salesman from making the sale, not even international politics. I love sales guys for that reason. Their motivation is very conspicuous and easy to understand.
Fantastic. So thank you everyone for getting this far with us. We've unpacked another great category leader based in Europe, best in the world. Join us next month when we dig into Zeiss. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much.